My name is Celeste Navarro. I'm 31 years old, and I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but not the way you're picturing it. I'm not the agent in the windbreaker with the badge clipped to my belt. I'm not the one standing at a press conference. I'm the one who sits 2 rooms away from all of that in a chair nobody photographs, doing work nobody announces. My title is Forensic Linguistic Analyst, but on certain case files, the ones with restricted access, the ones that require a second password and a third clearance level, I'm listed under a different name. They call me cartographer, not because I draw maps, because I map the way people think through the way they speak. And the only reason you're hearing that name right now is because of what happened at my mother's retirement party in a hotel ballroom in Phoenix, Arizona, on a Saturday afternoon when I was supposed to be invisible. I grew up in a house where being smart was fine, as long as you were smart in the right direction. My mother spent 28 years as a homicide detective with the Phoenix Police Department. She didn't dislike books. She just didn't see the point of them if they didn't lead somewhere useful. Useful meant a badge. Useful meant a sidearm. Useful meant something that looked like strength from the outside. My father left when I was 6. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because my mother became both parents after that, and both of her parenting styles ran through the same filter: discipline, output, results. She wasn't cruel, she was exacting. There's a difference, and it took me until my late 20s to understand that the difference still leaves a mark. I was the kid who read dictionaries for fun, not to memorize definitions, but because I liked the way words sat next to each other, the way one sound could shift a meaning 3 degrees. I was 9 when I started noticing that my mother spoke differently at the dinner table than she did on the phone with her sergeant. 10 when I started writing down the differences in a spiral notebook I kept under my mattress. By 12, I had 4 of those notebooks. By 14, I had taught myself the basics of phonetic transcription from a library book that had been checked out exactly twice before me. My mother found one of the notebooks once. I was 15. She flipped through it, said nothing for a long moment, then set it on the counter and said, "You know this isn't going to get you a job, right?" I said I knew. She said, "People who analyze things for a living end up in classrooms. People who act on things end up changing them." I didn't argue. I just went back to my room and opened another notebook. She wasn't trying to be mean. I believe that now in a way I couldn't then. She had built her entire identity around action, around physical presence, around things you could point to and say, "I did that." She didn't have language for what I did, so she defaulted to what she knew, which was skepticism. I got a full scholarship to the University of Arizona when I was 17. Linguistics with a minor in cognitive science. My mother drove me to the campus, helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, and when we stood in the small square of my dorm room, with the bed pushed under the window, she looked around and said, "Just make sure it leads somewhere. Not good luck, not I'm proud of you. Just make sure it leads somewhere." I cried that night after she left. Then I opened my laptop and started reading about forensic phonetics, and somewhere in the second hour, I forgot to be sad. The FBI came for me at a recruiting event during my junior year. A woman in a gray blazer sat across from me for 40 minutes asking questions that had nothing to do with my GPA or my internship history. She wanted to know how I identified deception in recorded speech. She wanted to know if I could distinguish between a speaker performing a dialect and a speaker raised in one. She asked me to listen to a 30-second audio clip on her laptop and tell her what I noticed. I told her the speaker was likely male, mid-40s, grew up in rural Georgia but had spent significant time in the Mid-Atlantic region, possibly DC or Baltimore. I told her he was reading from something, not speaking freely, and that the stress pattern on his third sentence suggested he had rehearsed it but hadn't believed it. She closed the laptop. She said, "We'll be in touch." They were. I started at the FBI's Phoenix field office 2 weeks after graduation. The title they gave me was Forensic Language Specialist. The work they gave me was nothing like what the title suggested. I wasn't transcribing interviews. I wasn't running voice comparisons on routine evidence. I was being handed audio files with no context, no case names, no identifying information, and I was being asked to tell them what I heard beneath the words: threat assessment, behavioral profiling through speech, regional dialect mapping on anonymous tip lines to identify geographic origins of callers who wanted to stay unknown. I was good at it in a way that surprised even me, the way a talent sometimes doesn't reveal its full shape until it has the right container. My mother called every few weeks in those first 2 years. The conversations were short and practical. She'd ask how I was eating. I'd say fine. She'd ask if I was being safe, which I understood to mean, are you in a feud she respected? I'd say yes. She wouldn't ask what I was working on, partly because I couldn't tell her, and partly because I think she didn't want the answer to disappoint her. What she knew was that I worked in an office, that I wore civilian clothes, that I didn't carry a weapon. She never said it plainly, but it was there in the pauses. The brief silence after I said I was doing well, before she changed the subject. The way she'd mention, casually, what her colleague's daughter was doing, the one who made detective at 26, the one who was up for a commendation. I stopped expecting a different kind of phone call. I just did my work, and my work in those years accumulated into something I didn't have a name for until my supervisor at the time, a man named Weston, called me into his office at the end of my third year and slid a folder across his desk. He said the unit was recommending me for a specialized assignment. He said it would require a second clearance level. He said my name wouldn't appear on anything external. I asked what they'd call me on the internal files. He said, whatever you want. I said cartographer. He wrote it down without asking why. The assignment was a joint task force involving the FBI, the DEA, and two federal prosecutors' offices in two different districts. The case centered on a network of fraud that had been running for 11 years across 6 states: insurance fraud, wire fraud, and a shell of medical billing schemes that had extracted somewhere in the range of $340 million from Medicare and private insurers. The network had been partially dismantled twice. Both times, key witnesses changed their testimony before trial. Both times, the cases collapsed. The problem wasn't evidence. There was plenty of evidence. The problem was communication. The network used coded language that sounded entirely ordinary. Phone calls between the ringleaders sounded like conversations between old friends, business partners, cousins catching up. Investigators would listen to the recordings and hear nothing. Prosecutors would read the transcripts and shrug. That's where I came in. It took me 4 months to map the full linguistic architecture of how they communicated. 4 months of listening, rewinding, listening again, building glossaries in a notebook nobody else had access to. I identified 47 phrases that functioned as code, including 11 that changed meaning depending on the speaker's position in the hierarchy. I produced a 90-page analysis that cross-referenced speech patterns across 230 recorded calls spanning 9 years. The analysis broke 3 witnesses. One of them, when confronted with the pattern map during a debrief, started crying before the prosecutor finished the first page. He said, "How does anyone even do this?" Nobody said my name. The case resolved in federal court on a Thursday morning in October. 11 convictions. Full sentencing on 8 counts. It was the largest successful prosecution of a Medicare fraud network in the southwestern United States in the previous decade, according to a statement from the DOJ that I read on my phone in a parking garage. Not a word about me. Not a syllable. I went home, made pasta, and watched something forgettable on TV. That was the job. My mother retired from the Phoenix PD on a Friday in March, 28 years and 4 months after she started. The department threw her a party at the Hilton near the airport. There was a banner. There were colleagues she'd worked cases with for 15 years. There was a slideshow. There were speeches. I flew home for the weekend. I wore a blue dress because she once told me she liked me in blue. I sat at a table near the middle of the room with some of her former colleagues and their spouses, and I smiled at the right moments and laughed at the right jokes and felt, the whole time, like I was translating a conversation being held in a language I understood perfectly but was never expected to contribute to. Her former lieutenant, a man named Calloway who had been with the department for 32 years, gave a speech. He talked about her case closure rates. He talked about the Mercer case in 2009, which she'd cracked in 6 days. He talked about the way newer detectives used to follow her through the department just to watch how she worked. Then he said, "The thing about a great detective is that they make the job look simple. But we all know it isn't simple. It takes courage. Real, visible, daily courage." Visible. I don't think he meant it the way I heard it. But I heard it. Afterward, my mother moved through the room the way she always moved, with purpose, like every step had a destination. She stopped at my table for a moment, touched my shoulder, said, "Glad you could make it." Then she moved on. One of her former partners, a woman named Tully, sat down next to me an hour into the reception. She was a few years from her own retirement and had the kind of face that had seen enough to stop performing surprise at anything. She asked what I was up to. I said I worked for the FBI. She said, "Oh, yeah. What kind of work?" I said, "Language analysis, communication patterns." She said, "Like transcription?" I said, "Sort of, but more behavioral." I said I worked on cases where the way someone spoke told us things the words themselves didn't. She looked at me differently then, not dramatically. Just a recalibration, the way a face does when it's updating information. She said, "That sounds like a real skill." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Does your mom know what you actually do?" I said I wasn't sure. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She talks about you, you know, not a lot, but she does. She told me once that you were the smartest person she knew, but that she worried you'd chosen a path where it was hard to tell if you were winning." I didn't have anything to say to that, so I just nodded. I flew back to Phoenix the next morning, and for the first time in a long time, I sat on that plane and felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Not anger exactly, not grief. Something smaller and more persistent, like a frequency that never quite resolves. 3 months after my mother's retirement party, I got pulled into an assignment that changed things. A federal judge in the District of Arizona had received a series of communications, 9 letters over 5 weeks, that the threat assessment unit believed were connected to an active intimidation campaign tied to a racketeering case scheduled for trial. The letters had no return address, no prints. Forensic processing turned up nothing. The language was careful, educated, and deeply unsettling in a way that was hard to articulate, hard for most people. I read the first letter and felt the ground shift under me the way it sometimes does when I hear something extraordinary, a particular sensation I've never found the right word for, somewhere between recognition and electricity. The writer was performing formality. Every sentence was technically correct, grammatically precise, but the rhythm was wrong. It was the rhythm of someone who had learned written English from reading, not from speaking it. Someone whose first spoken language had different clause length patterns, who was imposing those patterns on English text without realizing it. The word choices were slightly elevated in a specific way, words selected for their Latinate roots, which often indicates a speaker whose native language is Romance-based and who had absorbed English through academic exposure. By the fourth letter, I had a profile, mid to late 50s, highly educated, almost certainly raised speaking Spanish or Portuguese with significant immersion in English in an academic or legal setting. The specific word she used in letter 7, interlocutor, in a context that made perfect sense, but that native English speakers almost never use in informal writing, told me she had likely studied law or political science. I said she because of something in letter 6, a single pronoun used in a hypothetical construction that revealed the writer's assumption of her own perspective. It was the kind of slick that native speakers make without realizing it. I delivered my analysis on a Thursday, 12 pages. I included a geographic range based on dialect markers and two handwritten annotations the sender had made on documents included with letters 4 and 5. She'd noted page numbers in the margins. And the way she formed her numerals was consistent with educational systems in certain South American countries. The following Tuesday, federal agents arrested a woman matching the full profile. A former business partner of the racketeering defendant, a woman in her late 50s who had emigrated from Argentina at 23, held a law degree from a university in Buenos Aires, and had been quietly attempting to derail the trial from outside the defendant's visible network. She hadn't been on anyone's radar. I heard about the arrest through an internal memo. My name was not in it. 2 weeks later, I was in the break room filling a coffee cup when Weston came in and said there was someone who wanted to speak with me. He had a tone I hadn't heard from him before. Not quite formal. Something that sat between careful and respectful. I followed him down the hall to a conference room I'd never been in. It had a long table and no windows and two people sitting at the far end, a man I didn't recognize in a dark suit and the federal judge who had received the letters. The judge was a woman in her early 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that fills a room without effort. She stood when I walked in. She reached across the table and shook my hand. She said, "I asked to meet you. I hope that's all right." I said, "Of course." She said, "I've read your analysis 3 times. I've been on the federal bench for 19 years. I've worked with forensic analysts, behavioral experts, linguists, handwriting specialists. I have never read anything like what you produced. The precision of it, the restraint, the way you documented exactly what the evidence supported and nothing more." I didn't say anything. She said, "I wanted to say thank you in person, because you may never see that in writing." I said I understood. That was the job. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Do the people who matter to you know what you do?" I said, "Not exactly." She said, "I hope they find out." She did not yet know what she had just set in motion. I don't know exactly how my mother found out. What I know is that she called me on a Wednesday night 3 weeks after my meeting with the judge, and the first thing she said was not hello. She said, "A woman named Tully told me something today." I said, "Okay." She said she ran into someone at the courthouse last week, a federal clerk she knows, and apparently that clerk mentioned something about an analyst from the FBI whose profile was so accurate on the intimidation case that the judge herself requested a meeting. Apparently the clerk said the analyst's name. I didn't respond. She said, "Cartographer." The word sounded strange in her mouth. She'd never spoken a word of my professional world before. I said, "Mom." She said, "Is that you?" I said, "Yes." The silence on the other end was long enough that I counted the seconds. I got to 11. Then she said, quietly, "Tell me what you do." And so I did. For the first time in 8 years, I talked about my work without abbreviating it, without translating it into something more palatable, without preemptively apologizing for the fact that it didn't involve a badge or a gun or a case closure rate that could be listed in a speech. I told her about the fraud network and the 230 cores. I told her about the task force and the 90-page analysis and the witness who cried. I told her about cartographer and how the name ended up on my files and what it meant in terms of what I actually did. She was quiet through all of it. When I finished, she said, "How long?" I said, 8 years. Another silence. She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." She said, "I know." She said, "I thought," and then she stopped. "Started fight," and then she stopped. Started again. "I thought you were doing something small. Something that made you comfortable but didn't cost you anything." I said, "I know what you thought." She didn't say she was wrong. She didn't say she was sorry. What she said was, "The Mercer case, in 2009. There was a tip that came in on an anonymous line. The caller's voice was disguised, but we could tell it was someone educated, someone local, probably a woman. We couldn't trace it and we couldn't identify her, but without that tip, we would have gone in the wrong direction for another 6 months. 6 months we didn't have." She paused. "Is that the kind of thing you do?" I said yes. That was exactly the kind of thing I did. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, "I've been telling people my daughter works in administration." I said I knew. She said that was wrong of me. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She said, "I didn't know what to say, so I said the thing that didn't require me to understand it." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in 20 years. We didn't suddenly become a different kind of mother and daughter. There was no tear for reunion. We didn't start calling more often or diving into things we had left unspoken. That's not who either of us was, and it would have felt false, and I had spent enough of my life around false things to know what they sounded like. But something shifted. The negative space changed shape. She started asking different questions. Not many. She wasn't built for many, but different ones. She asked once whether I could actually tell if someone was lying from just their voice. I told her it was more complicated than that it wasn't about lying exactly, but about inconsistency, about the gap between what a person's speech patterns suggested they believed and what they were saying out loud. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's basically what I did. I just used a different instrument." I said, "Yes, that's basically it. The actual ceremony happened 8 months after that phone call. I wasn't expecting it. I hadn't been told anything specific, just that there was a joint recognition event at the FBI field office in Phoenix and that my attendance was requested, not required. Requested. I drove myself. I parked in the same garage I'd parked in every day for 8 years. I walked into the side entrance I always used. My name wasn't on the program. It never was. My mother was there. I didn't know that either. Weston had called her apparently. He told her only that her daughter was being recognized for her work and that it would mean a great deal if she came. He hadn't explained what the recognition was for. She came anyway, which told me something. She was sitting in the third row. Dark blazer, hair back, the same posture she'd carried for 30 years. She didn't see me come in. I sat 2 rows behind her. The SAC, the special agent in charge, a woman named Flores who I had worked near but never directly with, opened the proceedings. She described in general terms the nature of the joint task force work. She described the intimidation case and the arrest. She described the fraud network resolution and the Medicare case. She did not use case names. She did not use my name. She said there was an analyst whose work had operated for 8 years in the space where language meets intent, where the way a person spoke revealed what they couldn't afford to say. She said this analyst had contributed to 14 successful prosecutions without appearing in a single public record. She said the Bureau did not often recognize work done in this register, but that the director's office had specifically requested an exception be made. Then she paused. And she said, "We're asking cartographer to stand." There was a moment, just a moment where the room held its breath. I stood. My mother turned first. I don't know what she expected to see. Maybe she was still piecing it together, still connecting what Weston had told her to what was happening in front of her now. When her eyes found mine, she went very still. The same stillness she used to get in the field, I imagined. The absolute physical composure that some people develop when they need all their processing power for one thing. I walked to the front. I didn't rush. My footsteps were quiet on the carpet. A few people in the room turned to watch, and some of them had expressions I recognized, the look of people who had heard a name on restricted files and were now putting a face to it. SAC Flores shook my hand. She handed me a commendation letter in a sealed folder. She didn't speak into the microphone. She just nodded, the way you nod at someone when words have run out of room. I turned to face the room. My mother was still standing. She had risen at some point when I walked forward. I hadn't seen it happen, but there she was. Still, upright. Her hands at her sides, the way she'd trained herself to stand at attention when she was 22 years old and had never quite untrained herself. I looked at her. She looked at me. She didn't clap. She didn't smile, not the way people smile at performances. What she did was straighten her spine, which I would have said was impossible given how straight it already was, and lift her chin just slightly, the way she used to in the field when something surprised her, and she refused to show it, but couldn't quite suppress it entirely. It was the closest thing to pride I had ever seen on her face. It was small and compressed, and she probably thought I couldn't read it. I could read it. Reading was what I did. There was a reception afterward. I moved through it with a cup of coffee I didn't finish. A few agents spoke to me, brief substantive exchanges, people who had read my analyses or had worked adjacent to the cases. A younger analyst, maybe 2 years in, stopped me near the door. She was nervous in the way new people are nervous when they're trying to figure out if something is worth saying. She said she'd read the published portion of the forensic framework I'd built during the fraud case, the sections that had been cleared for internal training. She said it had changed how she approached intake. I thanked her. I meant it. My mother found me near the edge of the room about 40 minutes in. She stopped beside me rather than in front of me, which is how she'd always operated, side by side, not face to face. She said, "Cartographer." I said, "It seemed like the right word." She said, "You map how people think." I said, "Yes." She looked out at the room for a moment. Then she said, "When Calloway gave that speech at my retirement, he said, 'visible courage.'" I said I remembered. She said, "I've been thinking about that ever since, about what it means to do the work that nobody sees." She stopped. "I've spent 30 years believing that if something wasn't visible, it wasn't there, that you had to be able to point to it." She paused again. "I think I owe you a correction." She didn't say I'm sorry. She wasn't built for that particular arrangement of words, but she stood next to me in that room and she said, I owe you a correction. And from her, that was everything. We didn't stay much longer after that. She walked me to the parking garage. We stood by my car for a few minutes. She asked how long the commendation process had taken. I said I hadn't been told it was happening until 2 weeks before. She shook her head at that in the way she shook her head at that, in the way she shook her head at things she found structurally inefficient. Then she said, the Mercer case. I said yes. She said, that tip, the one that came in on the anonymous line. The caller was a woman with an education. That's what the analyst said at the time. They could tell that much. I said I knew that's what they'd said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, was it you? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not officially. She read the answer in the silence because she was a detective for 28 years and she knew exactly what silence meant. She reached out and put her hand on my arm for just a moment. A brief, firm press, not quite a hug, too deliberate to be accidental. Then she dropped her hand and said, drive safe. She walked to her car. She didn't look back, which was also how she operated. She made a decision and she moved. She didn't second guess. I sat in my car for a while before I started the engine. It didn't feel like winning. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like something older than both of those things. Like a frequency that had been just slightly unresolved for years had finally settled into the note it was always meant to be. I drove home. I put my commendation folder on my desk without opening it again. I made a cup of tea and stood at my kitchen window watching the lights of the city do what city lights do, which is mostly just suggest the presence of other lives without giving anything specific away. I thought about what she'd said. I owe you a correction. I thought about how long I'd waited for something like that, and how when it finally came it didn't arrive the way I'd imagined it. It didn't arrive with fanfare or confession or a clearing of the air. It arrived sideways, in a parking garage, from a woman who had spent 30 years learning to be unafraid of everything except the ordinary work of saying she had been wrong. I understood that now. It was its own kind of language, one I had never learned to read before because I had never given it enough space to mean something. The next morning, I went back to work. I had 3 files on my desk, 2 audio assignments, and 1 written communication case, all of them restricted, all of them unnamed. I poured a cup of coffee, sat down, put on my headphones, and began to listen. That's what I do. I listen for what the words don't say. I map the space between what someone means and what they allow themselves to speak out loud. It took my mother 61 years to speak something she'd been carrying for 30. And I heard it, all of it, without her having to say a single word. That's the job. And it took a long time, longer than it should have, for me to understand that it was also, in the quietest way, the exact same job as hers. I used to think recognition was something that arrived on schedule, that if you did the work long enough and well enough, eventually someone who mattered would turn around and see it. What I didn't understand, what took me most of my 30s to figure out, is that recognition and understanding are 2 completely different things, and sometimes the people closest to you can only offer one of them at a time. My mother spent 28 years solving things by being present, physical, visible, on the scene. That wasn't a flaw in how she was built. It was the logic of the world she'd chosen, and it had served her well in ways I genuinely respected. But it meant that when I chose a different kind of presence, one that operated through inference and pattern, and the careful study of what people revealed without meaning to, she didn't have a framework for it. She couldn't value what she couldn't see. And here's what I've come to believe about that, not bitterly but plainly. It wasn't her fault. It was a failure of translation. She spoke one language, I spoke another, and for 8 years neither of us had found a way across. What changed things wasn't my success. It wasn't the commendation or the ceremony, or a room full of federal agents going quiet when my code name was called. Those things mattered, but they were just the occasion. What actually changed things was a parking garage in Phoenix and a woman who had spent 61 years being certain about everything, saying 4 words she had never said to me before. I owe you a correction. That's it. That was the whole thing. I think about that a lot, about how long some truths take to surface, about how a person can carry an error for decades without naming it, and what it costs them, and what it costs the people around them. My mother wasn't a careless woman, she was an exacting one. But exacting people make their own particular category of mistake. They hold their standards so tightly that sometimes they apply them to the wrong things, and by the time they realize it, years have passed. I made my own mistakes in that time. I let her silence convince me that she was indifferent, when really she was just lost. I stopped trying to explain my work because I expected her not to understand it, and in doing that, I gave her less credit than she deserved. I assumed she was incapable of adjusting. She proved me wrong. That's the thing about people. They can surprise you if you give them enough room to move. What I know now, the thing I carry with me into every file, every audio clip, every case that arrives with no context and no name, is that the most important work is often the work that looks like nothing from the outside. Endurance without applause is its own kind of discipline. It builds something in you that visible success simply doesn't, because it requires you to find your own reasons to keep going, separate from anyone else's recognition. I kept going because the work was real and because it mattered, even when no one said so. And eventually the truth caught up with us, me, my mother, all of it. Not dramatically, just steadily, the way most real things do. That's enough. It turns out that's more than enough.